The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding mountain road as Margaret Chen made her way home from the valley. At 62, she had walked this path countless times, her worn boots knowing every rock and root along the way. She lived in a small cabin her father had built decades ago, tending a modest garden and selling vegetables at the farmer's market in town. Margaret had learned long ago that life didn't always turn out as planned. Her husband had passed 15 years earlier, and her daughter lived 3 states away with a family of her own. But Margaret had made peace with her solitude. She found richness in simple things, the way morning light filtered through pine trees, the satisfaction of soil beneath her fingernails, the kindness of neighbors who still checked on her. As she rounded a bend in the road, something caught her eye. A man lay crumpled near the shoulder, his dark jacket torn and bloodied. His face was bruised, and he appeared to be in his late 50s, with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of a life fully lived. Margaret's heart quickened, but her hands remained steady. Years of living alone had taught her both caution and compassion. She knelt beside him, checking for breath. It came shallow but regular. "Sir," she said softly. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes that held confusion and pain. He tried to speak, but winced instead. "Don't try to move just yet," Margaret said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had nursed sick animals and tended to her husband in his final days. "I'm going to help you." She looked around. No other cars, no cell phone signal this high up the mountain. Her cabin was only half a mile away. She couldn't carry him, but perhaps she could help him walk. "My name is Margaret," she said, meeting his eyes. "I live nearby. Do you think you can stand if I help you?" He nodded slightly, and together they managed to get him upright. He was taller than she'd thought, and despite his injuries, there was a quiet strength about him. They moved slowly, his arm across her shoulders, her arm steady around his waist. The walk took nearly 40 minutes. Margaret talked softly the whole way, about the mountain, about the deer that visited her garden, about anything that might keep him conscious and calm. He said nothing, but she felt him listening. Inside her small cabin, she settled him on her sofa and began tending his wounds with practiced hands. Nothing seemed broken, though the cuts and bruises told the story of a serious accident. "What happened?" she finally asked as she cleaned a gash on his forehead. "My car," he said, his voice rough. "Went off the road about a mile back. I tried to walk. Couldn't remember which way." Margaret nodded. People got disoriented on these mountain roads, especially after trauma. She'd call for help once he was stable, though her landline was temperamental at best. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated just for a moment. "James. James Thornton." Over the next few hours, Margaret made him tea, brought him blankets, and prepared a simple meal of soup and bread. James ate slowly, watching her move around the cabin with quiet efficiency. He noticed the well-worn furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the shelves lined with books that looked read and reread. "You live here alone?" he asked. 15 years now," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from him. "It's peaceful. Sometimes lonely, but mostly peaceful. No family. A daughter in Ohio. She worries, but she has her own life. That's as it should be." James was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't ask if I had money for a doctor or call the police. You just helped." Margaret smiled. "My mother used to say that kindness doesn't wait for credentials. You needed help. I could give it. That's enough." Something in James's expression shifted. A softness around his eyes, a release of tension he'd been carrying. By the next morning, James was stronger. Margaret had given him her late husband's clothes, and he'd cleaned up as best he could. Over breakfast, they talked more easily. He told her he'd been driving through, thinking about his life, not paying enough attention to the winding road. "I've spent 40 years building a business," he said quietly. "Started with nothing, worked every day, made more money than I ever imagined. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like when people helped me just because I needed help." Margaret poured more coffee. "Success can be isolating. My husband used to say that." He was right. James looked at her directly. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." "My company. It's Thornton Industries. Maybe you've heard of it?" She shook her head. I don't follow business news much. He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. That's refreshing. Margaret, I'm what people call a billionaire. And you saved my life without knowing or caring about any of that. Margaret studied him. Would it have mattered if I'd known? To most people, yes. To you, I don't think so. She poured herself more coffee. People are people, James. Rich or poor, we all bleed the same. We all need help sometimes. In the days that followed, James arranged for his car to be recovered and his injuries properly examined. But he kept returning to Margaret's cabin. They talked for hours about life, loss, what matters in the end. He learned about her struggles to keep the cabin, the property taxes she could barely afford, her dream of maybe visiting her daughter but never quite having enough saved. Let me help you, James finally said. Margaret shook her head. I didn't help you for a reward, I know. That's exactly why I want to do this. Not as payment, as gratitude, as friendship. The conversation continued over weeks. Finally, they reached an understanding. James would set up a trust that ensured Margaret could keep her home and live comfortably. In return, he asked only that she let him visit sometimes to remember what matters. But he did more. He established a foundation in Margaret's name, supporting programs that helped people in rural communities, people who might not have resources but possessed the kind of rich human kindness that had saved his life. At the foundation's first meeting, James told the story of a woman who helped a stranger on a mountain road. He didn't give her name or details, but afterward Margaret called him. That was kind of you, she said, not to make a fuss. Some things are sacred, James replied. Kindness doesn't need spotlights. Years later, Margaret still lives in her cabin, though now she visits her daughter regularly, and her garden flourishes with new tools and better seeds. James comes by every few months, and they sit on the porch drinking coffee, watching the mountains turn purple in the evening light. They talk about life's lessons, how wealth means nothing if your heart is poor, how the smallest acts can change everything, how being seen as simply human might be the greatest gift one person can give another. Margaret sometimes thinks about that afternoon when she found James on the road. She never expected anything to come of it. She just did what felt right, and in the end, isn't that how the best stories begin? With one person choosing kindness, not knowing where it might lead, but trusting that helping another human being is never wasted effort. Sometimes the mountain gives us exactly what we need, not what we planned for, but what our hearts require to remember who we truly are.